I used to think unconditional love was real. I used to believe that family meant standing by each other no matter what. I used to think my parents' wealth came with wisdom, not just zeros in their bank account. How naive I was at 22, sitting in that pristine living room with my heart hammering against my ribs, watching my mother's perfectly manicured fingers drum against her designer handbag, while my father's cold eyes bore into me like I was some stranger who'd wandered into their mansion uninvited. "We're cutting you off completely, Sophia," my mother said, her voice as sterile as the white marble floors beneath my feet. "No more allowance. No more credit cards. No more tuition payments. Nothing." The words hit me like a physical blow. My lungs forgot how to work. My vision blurred at the edges. 3 years into my business degree at Stanford, with a 3.8 GPA and dreams of working alongside my father in his real estate empire, and they were throwing me away like yesterday's newspaper. All because of him. All because of Marcus. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my voice cracking like I was 13 again, begging them to let me keep the stray kitten I'd found. But this wasn't about a pet. This was about the man I loved, the man who made me laugh until my sides ached, who held me when I cried about the pressure of living up to the Whitmore name, who saw me as just Sophia, not an extension of my parents' social status. My father leaned forward in his leather chair, the same chair where he'd once read me bedtime stories, and his face was carved from granite. Dead serious. "You want to throw your life away on some mechanic from the wrong side of town? Fine. But you'll do it without our money." The way he said mechanic made my skin crawl. Like Marcus was something dirty he'd stepped in. Like the man who could rebuild an engine with his eyes closed, who was putting himself through night school for his business degree, who worked 16-hour days to support his sick mother, was somehow less than human because he didn't have a trust fund. "He's not just a mechanic," I said, my voice growing stronger despite the tears threatening to spill. "He owns his own shop. He's building something from nothing. He's using you," my mother interrupted, finally looking up from her nails. Her blue eyes, the same color as mine, were ice cold. "Can't you see that? A girl with your background, your connections, your money? He hit the lottery with you, sweetheart, and you're too blinded by some fantasy of true love to see it." The rage that shot through me was so sudden, so intense, I actually saw red around the edges of my vision. "How dare you?" I breathed. "You don't even know him. You met him once for 20 minutes and you've already decided 20 minutes was enough," my father said, standing up and smoothing down his $1,000 suit. "I've been around long enough to spot a gold digger from a mile away." The way he looked at this house, at your jewelry, at your car. He was calculating, Sophia. Adding up dollar signs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something at that massive oil painting of some long-dead ancestor hanging behind his head, because they were wrong. So completely, utterly wrong it made my chest physically ache. Marcus hadn't even wanted to come to dinner that night. I'd practically dragged him here, begging him to meet my parents, convinced that once they saw how genuine he was, how much he loved me, they'd welcome him with open arms. Instead, they'd spent the entire evening asking subtle but pointed questions about his family, his background, his prospects. My mother had actually used air quotes when she said that word, sitting there in her designer dress that cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, looking at the man I loved like he was some kind of con artist. "You want to know what Marcus was calculating?" I said, standing up so fast the coffee table rattled. "He was calculating how quickly he could leave. He was calculating how much of your judgment he could take before he walked out that door and never came back. He didn't want your money. He didn't even want to be here." My father's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Of course that's what he told you. That's what they all say, sweetheart. I don't want your money, I just want you, right up until they're emptying your bank account and moving on to the next naive rich girl." The dismissal in his voice, the casual cruelty of it, made something inside me snap. This was my father. The man who used to swing me around the backyard until I was dizzy with laughter. The man who taught me to ride a bike, who came to every school play, who told me I could be anything I wanted to be. And now he was looking at me like I was a foolish child who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. "I'm not naive," I said, my voice steady now, fueled by a cold fury I'd never felt before. "I'm in love with a good man who treats me better than anyone ever has. Who doesn't care that I drive a BMW or wear designer clothes? Who loves me for me, not for what I can give him? Then prove it," my mother said, her voice like silk wrapped around a blade. "Walk away from all of this. Live on his mechanic's salary. See how long that love lasts when you're shopping at thrift stores and living in some rundown apartment? The challenge hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. They thought they had me. They thought I was too soft, too spoiled, too dependent on their money to survive without it. They thought I'd come crawling back within a month, begging forgiveness and promising to dump Marcus like a bad habit. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Fine," I said, my voice calm as a lake before a storm. "Fine. Cut me off. Take your money and your conditions and your judgment. I'll make it work." For the first time since this nightmare conversation started, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's face. "Sophia, don't be dramatic. You have no idea what it's like out there without what? Without parents who love me unconditionally? Without family who supports my choices? You're right, I don't know what that's like. But I'm about to find out." I turned to leave, my legs shaking but my spine straight. Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, the creak of my father's chair as he stood up. "If you walk out that door," he called after me, his voice carrying that familiar note of authority that used to make me freeze in my tracks, "don't expect to come back. Don't expect us to bail you out when reality hits. This is your choice, Sophia. Choose wisely." I paused at the doorway, my hand on the ornate brass handle, and turned back to look at them one last time. They stood there in their perfect living room with their perfect furniture and their perfect lives, and all I could think was how empty it all looked, how cold. "I am choosing wisely," I said. "I'm choosing love over money. I'm choosing someone who believes in me over people who think I'm too weak to make my own decisions. I'm choosing my future over your past." My mother's face crumpled for just a second, and I saw something that might have been regret flash in her eyes. But then her mask slipped back into place and she was stone again. "We'll see," was all she said. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. Not when I heard my father's heavy footsteps following me to the foyer. Not when my mother called my name from the living room. Not when I climbed into my BMW, my soon-to-be former BMW, and drove away from the only life I'd ever known. The tears didn't come until I was halfway to Marcus's apartment. Then they came all at once, a flood of grief and rage and terror that had me pulling over to the shoulder of the highway, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat there in my luxury car on the side of the road and sobbed like a child, mourning the death of the parents I thought I knew. Because the people in that house, the ones who'd just thrown me away like garbage, weren't the parents who'd raised me. Those parents would have wanted me to be happy. Those parents would have given Marcus a chance. Those parents would have chosen their daughter over their prejudices. But maybe I'd never really known them at all. Maybe the unconditional love I'd felt was just conditional love with better marketing. Love that came with strings attached, with expectations and requirements and a price tag I'd never bothered to read. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. A text from Marcus. "Hey, beautiful. How did dinner with the parents go? Can't wait to hear all about it. Love you." Fresh tears spilled down my cheeks as I stared at those words. Sweet, optimistic Marcus, who'd been nervous about meeting them but trying not to show it. Who'd bought a new shirt for the occasion and asked me 3 times if he looked okay. Who had no idea that his girlfriend had just been disowned for the crime of loving him. I couldn't tell him over text. Hell, I didn't know how I was going to tell him at all. How do you explain to someone that your parents think they're a gold-digging loser? How do you admit that the people who raised you are shallow, classist monsters who value money over human decency? I drove to his apartment complex in a daze, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The familiar sight of the modest building with its peeling paint and chain-link fence hit me differently this time. 3 hours ago, I'd thought of it as charmingly authentic, a glimpse into a life more real than my sheltered existence. Now I saw it through my parents' eyes, rundown, poor, beneath me. The realization made me sick. Marcus was waiting for me in the parking lot, probably having heard my car pull up. He looked so handsome in his new shirt, his dark hair still damp from the shower, his face lighting up with that smile that never failed to make my heart skip. When he saw my tear-stained face, his expression shifted immediately to concern. "Soph, what happened? Are you okay?" I fell into his arms and let him hold me while I cried into his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with motor oil that always clung to his skin no matter how much he scrubbed. His hands rubbed gentle circles on my back, and he made soft, shushing sounds like I was something precious and fragile. "Talk to me," he murmured into my hair. "What's wrong? Did something happen with your parents?" I pulled back to look at him, this man who worked himself to the bone every day, who was respectful and kind and funny and real, who loved me with a fierce intensity that had nothing to do with my bank account and everything to do with who I was when I was with him. And I realized that my parents weren't just wrong about him. They were blind to something beautiful and rare. They cut me off, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Completely. No more money, no more tuition, no more anything. Because of you. Because they think you're using me. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, hurt, anger, and finally something that looked like defeat. He stepped back from me, his hands falling to his sides, and I watched the light dim in his eyes. Maybe they're right, he said quietly. Maybe I am holding you back. Maybe you should... Don't, I said, grabbing his hands and holding them tight. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Don't you dare let their poison get into your head. Sophia, be realistic. You're used to a certain lifestyle. You're in the middle of your degree at Stanford. Your whole future is mapped out, and it doesn't include struggling to pay rent and eating ramen noodles for dinner. The doubt in his voice broke my heart. This was exactly what my parents had wanted, to make him feel small, unworthy, like he was dragging me down. They'd planted their seeds of insecurity, and now they were growing, choking out the confidence I loved so much about him. You want to know what my future includes? I said, stepping closer and cupping his face in my hands. It includes you. It includes building something together, something that's ours. My parents think you're not good enough for me, but they're wrong. I'm not good enough for you. He started to protest, but I pressed my finger to his lips. Let me finish. You've worked for everything you have. You've earned every success, every dollar, every opportunity. I've been handed everything on a silver platter, and I've never had to fight for anything in my life. Until now. Until you? The tears were coming again, but these were different. These were tears of determination, of clarity, of a future taking shape in my mind like a photograph developing. I don't need their money, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. I need you. I need us. And if they can't see what an incredible man you are, then that's their loss. Marcus pulled me close again, and I felt some of the tension leave his body. Are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once we go down this road, there's no going back. Your parents made that pretty clear. I thought about the cold dismissal in my father's voice, the calculating cruelty in my mother's eyes, the way they'd looked at Marcus like he was something they'd scrape off their shoe, the way they'd looked at me like I was a disappointment, a failure, a naive child who couldn't be trusted to make her own choices. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, I said. Let them keep their money and their conditions and their judgment. We'll build our own empire. And someday, when we're successful beyond their wildest dreams, they'll realize what they threw away. It was a bold declaration, spoken in the heat of emotion and heartbreak. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt something shift inside me. A cold, calculating part of my brain that I'd never accessed before was already starting to work, already starting to plan. They thought I was weak. They thought I was dependent. They thought I'd come crawling back, begging for forgiveness and ready to dump the man I loved for the promise of financial security. They had no idea how wrong they were. And by the time I was done, by the time Marcus and I had built something beautiful and successful and completely ours, they would know exactly what they'd lost. But that night, sitting in Marcus's tiny apartment with its secondhand furniture and hand-me-down dishes, all I could think about was the crushing weight of starting over. I'd never paid a bill in my life. I'd never had to budget for groceries or worry about rent. My credit cards had never been declined. My bank account had never run low. The reality of what I'd signed up for was starting to sink in, and it was terrifying. Marcus seemed to sense my panic. He made me tea in a chipped mug and wrapped me in his warmest blanket, then sat beside me on his threadbare couch and just held me while I processed everything that had happened. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "I know it seems impossible right now, but we'll figure it out. I've got some money saved up and the shop is doing better every month. We can get you through your last year of school and then—" "No," I said, pulling back to look at him. "I'm not taking your money. I'm not going to be another burden for you to carry." "You're not a burden, Soph. You're my partner." Partners help each other. The word partner sparked something in my brain. I'd been thinking about this all wrong, approaching it like I was some helpless victim who needed to be rescued. But I wasn't helpless. I had skills, knowledge, connections, things that had value beyond my parents' bank account. "Partners," I repeated slowly. "You're right. We're partners. which means we pool our resources and build something together. What are you thinking? I stood up and started pacing his small living room, my mind racing. I'm thinking that you're an incredible mechanic with a growing business and a head for innovation. And I'm thinking that I've spent 3 years studying business and finance, learning from some of the best professors in the country. My parents taught me about real estate and investing whether they meant to or not. I grew up listening to their conversations, watching their deals, absorbing their strategies. Marcus was watching me pace, and I could see the wheels turning in his head too. I'm thinking, I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word, that we have everything we need to build something amazing, something that's completely ours, something that would make my parents' little real estate empire look like a lemonade stand. Sophia ... No, hear me out. Your shop is already successful, but it's small scale. What if we expanded? What if we turned it into something bigger? A full-service automotive center, maybe even a chain. I could handle the business side, the financing, the expansion strategy. You could handle the operations, the technical side, the quality control. I could see it forming in my mind, this vision of what we could build together. Not just a business, but a partnership that would prove to everyone, especially my parents, that love and ambition weren't mutually exclusive. It would take capital, Marcus said carefully. A lot of capital. More than I have saved. Then we get creative. We start small and reinvest everything. We take on investors if we have to. We work 18-hour days and sacrifice everything for the first few years. Whatever it takes. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him running calculations in his head, weighing possibilities against risks. Finally, he looked up at me with something that looked like cautious hope. You're serious about this? Dead serious. It would mean giving up everything you're used to. At least for a while. Maybe for a long while. Good, I said, and I meant it. I'm tired of things being handed to me. I'm tired of living off my parents' success instead of creating my own. I want to earn what I have. I want to build something that matters. Marcus stood up and pulled me into his arms, and when he kissed me, I tasted possibility and determination and the faint flavor of the future we were about to create. Okay, he said against my lips. Let's do it. Let's build an empire. That night, we stayed up until sunrise making plans. Real plans with numbers and timelines and strategies. I pulled out my laptop and started researching market trends, expansion opportunities, financing options. Marcus sketched out ideas for services we could offer, improvements we could make to his existing shop, ways to streamline operations and increase efficiency. By the time the sun came up, we had the skeleton of a business plan and something that felt dangerously close to hope. I called in sick to my classes that day, something I'd never done in my life, and spent the entire day at Marcus's shop, really seeing it for the first time. Not as his girlfriend making a social visit, but as his potential business partner, evaluating our starting point with a critical eye. The shop was small but well organized, with top-quality tools and equipment that Marcus had invested in carefully over the years. His customer base was loyal and growing, mostly through word-of-mouth referrals. His employees, all 2 of them, clearly respected him and took pride in their work. The foundation was solid. We just needed to build on it. I spent the morning going through his books, analyzing his profit margins, identifying areas where we could improve efficiency or increase revenue. Marcus walked me through every aspect of the operation, explaining his processes, introducing me to his team, showing me the work they were capable of. The biggest limitation is space, he said as we stood in the cramped office that doubled as a break room. I've got a waiting list of customers, but I can only take on so much work with the facilities I have now. What about that building next door? I asked, looking through the grimy window at the empty storefront that had been vacant for months. What about it? It's been empty for a while. The rent is probably reasonable. We could expand into it, add more bays, maybe even a customer lounge. Marcus followed my gaze, and I could see him imagining the possibilities. It would be expensive. New equipment, renovation costs, hiring more staff. Everything worthwhile is expensive at first, I said. The question is whether the investment will pay off. We spent the afternoon walking through the empty building next door, measuring spaces, discussing layouts, dreaming out loud about what we could create. The owner was eager to rent it. Apparently, it had been sitting empty for 8 months and was willing to negotiate on terms. By the end of the day, we had a rough timeline for expansion and a list of everything we'd need to make it happen. The numbers were daunting, but not impossible. If we were smart about it, if we were willing to work harder than we'd ever worked before, if we were willing to sacrifice comfort for growth, we could make it happen. That evening, I called my bank to check my account balance. My parents had already canceled my credit cards, but I still had access to my checking and savings accounts, money that was technically mine, accumulated from birthday gifts, summer jobs, and the small allowance I'd been too proud to spend frivolously. It wasn't much by my parents' standards, but it was enough to get us started, enough to put down deposits, buy some equipment, cover the first few months of expanded rent. It felt strange, liberating and terrifying at the same time, to be planning to spend my own money on my own future instead of relying on my parents' generosity. The hardest part was dropping out of Stanford. I'd worked so hard to get there, maintained my grades despite the social pressures and the constant temptation to coast on my family name. My professors were disappointed. My academic advisor tried to talk me out of it. My few real friends thought I'd lost my mind. "You're throwing away your education for some guy?" My roommate Sarah said when I told her I wouldn't be coming back next semester. "Sophia, be smart about this. Your parents will come around eventually, but if you drop out now, you might never get another chance." I packed my belongings from my dorm room in silence, letting her words wash over me without really listening. She meant well, but she didn't understand. None of them understood. They saw Marcus as some guy I was infatuated with, a phase I was going through that would eventually burn out. They couldn't see what I saw, a partnership that could become something extraordinary. My parents made one last attempt to change my mind, showing up at Marcus's apartment 3 weeks after our confrontation. I was there working on business plans when I heard the knock on the door, and my heart stopped when I saw them through the peephole. They looked older somehow, smaller. My mother's perfect composure had cracks in it, and my father's confidence seemed forced. For a moment, I wondered if they'd come to apologize, to accept Marcus and welcome me back into the family. I should have known better. "We've heard you dropped out of school," my mother said without preamble when I opened the door. "This has gone far enough, Sophia. Come home. We'll forgive this nonsense and get you re-enrolled for the spring semester." "There's nothing to forgive," I said, not inviting them in. "I made my choice. A choice you're going to regret for the rest of your life," my father said. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Your education, your future, your family, all for what? A fling with someone who can't even afford to take you to a decent restaurant?" The casual cruelty of it, the complete dismissal of everything Marcus and I had built in just a few weeks, made my jaw clench. "He's not a fling. He's my partner, in every sense of the word." "Partner?" My mother laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Sweetheart, you've been playing house for 3 weeks. You have no idea what the real world is like." "Then let me learn," I said. "Let me figure it out on my own instead of trying to control every aspect of my life." "We're not trying to control you," my father said. "We're trying to protect you from making a mistake that will ruin your future." "My future is my choice to make, not when you're making it with our money," my mother snapped. "The money in your accounts? That came from us. The car you're driving? We bought it. Even this little rebellion of yours is being funded by us." The words hit like a slap, because she was right, partially. The money I'd been using to help fund our expansion had come from them, directly or indirectly. Birthday gifts, graduation presents, allowances I'd saved. It was all connected to them, all tainted by their control. "Fine," I said, my voice deadly calm. "You want your money back? Done. I'll transfer every penny back to you tomorrow. The car too. I don't want anything that comes with strings attached." For the first time since they'd arrived, my parents looked uncertain. They'd expected me to cave, to realize how dependent I was on them and come crawling back. They hadn't expected me to cut the last ties that bound us together. "Sophia, be reasonable," my father said. "You can't survive on nothing. You have no job, no degree, no real-world experience. Watch me." I closed the door in their faces and leaned against it, my hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. Through the thin wood, I could hear them talking in low, urgent voices. Eventually, their footsteps retreated down the hallway, and I heard their car start up in the parking lot. Marcus emerged from the bedroom where he'd been hiding, giving me space to handle my family drama. His face was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. "No," I said honestly, "but I will be." The next morning, I went to the bank and transferred every penny from my accounts back to my parents. It left me with less than $300 to my name and a bone-deep determination to prove them wrong. I drove my BMW to the nearest dealership and traded it in for a 10-year-old Honda Civic, using the difference to add to our business fund. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely liberating. For the first time in my life, I owned nothing that I hadn't earned myself. I had no safety net, no fallback plan, no wealthy parents to bail me out if things went wrong. I had Marcus, I had our dreams, and I had a fierce determination to succeed that burned brighter than anything I'd ever felt before. The first few months were brutal. We worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I handled the books, the scheduling, the customer service, the marketing, anything that didn't require getting my hands dirty with actual car repair. Marcus and his expanded team worked on the cars while I worked on building the business side of our operation. We lived on ramen noodles and coffee, slept on an air mattress in the back office when we were too tired to drive home, and reinvested every penny of profit back into the business. I learned to change my own oil, balance books down to the cent, and negotiate with suppliers like my life depended on it. Some days, the exhaustion and stress were so overwhelming that I questioned everything. Was I crazy to throw away my privileged life for this constant struggle? Was I being stubborn and self-destructive, cutting off my nose to spite my face? But then I'd see Marcus explaining a complex repair to a customer with infinite patience, or watch our balance sheet slowly climbing toward profitability, or get a thank you card from a client whose car we'd brought back from the dead, and I'd remember why we were doing this. We weren't just building a business. We were building a life together, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dreams, instead of financial dependence and social expectations. Every small victory was ours, earned through our own sweat and sacrifice and determination. By the end of our first year, we'd expanded into the building next door, hired 3 more employees, and established ourselves as the go-to automotive center in our part of town. We were nowhere near millionaires, but we were profitable, growing, and completely self-sufficient. More importantly, we were happy. Exhausted, stressed, covered in motor oil half the time, but genuinely happy in a way I'd never been during my sheltered, privileged childhood. I hadn't spoken to my parents in months when my phone rang on a Tuesday evening in late spring. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me pick up. Sophia? The voice was hesitant, uncertain. It's Mom. My heart stopped. In all the months since our confrontation, she'd never called. I'd wondered sometimes if they thought about me, if they missed me, if they regretted the choice they'd forced on all of us, but I'd never expected to hear from them. "Hi," I said carefully, not sure how to navigate this conversation. She paused, and I could hear the struggle in her voice. "I wanted to know how you're doing. I heard through the grapevine that you and Marcus have a business together." The grapevine was probably one of their society friends who'd had their car worked on at our shop. Word was starting to get around about the quality of our work, and our customer base was slowly expanding beyond the local neighborhood to include some higher-end clients. "We do," I said. "We're doing well." That's good. I'm glad you're doing well." The conversation was stilted, awkward, full of everything we weren't saying. I wanted to ask if she missed me, if she regretted cutting me off, if she'd finally realized that Marcus wasn't the gold-digging loser they'd assumed he was. But I didn't. The wounds were still too fresh, the hurt still too raw. "Sophia," she said finally, "I know things ended badly between us. I know your father and I said some things we probably shouldn't have said, but you're still our daughter. You'll always be our daughter. Then why haven't you acted like it?" The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I couldn't take them back. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of her breathing on the other end of the line. "Because we were scared," she said finally, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Because we love you so much that the thought of you getting hurt, of someone taking advantage of you, was unbearable. We thought we were protecting you." "You weren't protecting me," I said. "You were controlling me. There's a difference." "I know that now. Do you?" Another long pause. Then, "We'd like to meet with you. Both of you. Marcus too. If you're willing?" I closed my eyes and leaned against the wall of our office, trying to process this unexpected olive branch. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to grab onto this chance to reconcile with my family, but another part of me, the part that had been forged in the fire of rejection and disappointment, was more cautious. "Why now?" I asked. "Because we were wrong," she said simply. "Because we miss our daughter. Because life is too short to let pride and fear keep us apart." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was as close as my mother had ever come to admitting she'd made a mistake. And despite everything they'd put me through, despite the months of silence and the cruel things they'd said about Marcus, I found myself wanting to believe her. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "That's all I can ask." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet office for a long time, staring at my phone and trying to figure out what I was feeling. Relief? Hope? Suspicion? All of the above? Marcus found me there an hour later, still staring at nothing and turning my phone over and over in my hands. "Everything okay?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. I told him about the call, about my mother's request to meet, about the apology that wasn't quite an apology. He listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful. "What do you want to do?" he asked when I finished. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to see them, to try to rebuild our relationship. But part of me is terrified that this is just another manipulation, another attempt to control my life." "What does your gut tell you?" I thought about it, really thought about it. What did my instincts say about my mother's call, about the tone of her voice, about the words she'd chosen? "My gut tells me she's sincere," I said slowly, "that she really does miss me and regret how things ended. But my gut also tells me that they haven't really changed, that they still think I made the wrong choice, and they're hoping I'll eventually come to my senses." Marcus nodded. "So, what's the worst thing that could happen if we meet with them? They're still the same judgmental, controlling people they were before, and we end up right back where we started. And the best thing that could happen? They've actually learned something from this experience, and we can find a way to have a relationship again. Seems like the potential upside outweighs the risk," he said. "But it's your call. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." That was Marcus in a nutshell, supportive without being pushy, willing to follow my lead even when it affected him directly. My parents had been wrong about so many things, but they'd been most wrong about him. I called my mother back the next day and agreed to meet for dinner at a neutral restaurant. Somewhere public, somewhere that didn't belong to any of us, somewhere we could all leave if things went badly. The week leading up to the dinner crawled by like a prison sentence. I changed my outfit 3 times, practiced conversations in the mirror, and drove Marcus crazy with my anxiety. By the time we pulled into the restaurant parking lot, my hands were shaking and my stomach was in knots. My parents were already there, seated at a corner table that offered privacy but still felt exposed. They looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow. My mother's hair had more gray in it, and my father's shoulders seemed less broad, less commanding. They stood when they saw us approaching, and for a moment, nobody moved. Then my mother stepped forward and pulled me into a hug that was tentative at first, then fierce and desperate. "I've missed you so much," she whispered into my hair, and I felt tears spring to my eyes despite my determination to stay strong. My father shook Marcus's hand with what looked like genuine respect, then gave me a hug that lasted longer than any hug we'd shared since I was a child. We sat down and ordered drinks, and for a few minutes, we made awkward small talk about the weather, the restaurant, anything but the elephant in the room. Finally, my father cleared his throat and looked directly at Marcus. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A big one. I judged you without knowing you, and I was wrong. About your character, about your intentions, about your worth as a man." Marcus looked surprised. We both did. This wasn't the conversation I'd expected to have. "I was so afraid of my daughter being taken advantage of," my father continued, "that I couldn't see what was actually happening. That she'd found someone who loved her for exactly who she is, not what she could give him." "It's okay, Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said quietly. "You were trying to protect her." "I understand that." "No, it's not okay," my mother said, her voice firm. "We were cruel. To both of you. We let our fears and our prejudices make us say terrible things, and we hurt people we love." I felt something inside my chest loosen, a knot of anger and hurt that had been there for months finally starting to untangle. "We know we can't undo the damage we've done," my father said, looking at me now. "We know we can't take back the things we said or the way we made you feel. But we want to try to rebuild our relationship if you're willing." "What's changed?" I asked. "A year ago, you were convinced that Marcus was using me and that I was throwing my life away. What's different now?" My parents exchanged a look and my father sighed heavily. "We hired a private investigator," he said, and my blood ran cold. "I know how that sounds, and I know it was wrong, but we needed to know how you were doing. We needed to know if our fears were justified." "You had me followed?" I couldn't keep the outrage out of my voice. "Not followed," my mother said quickly. "Just checked on." Financial records, business filings, that sort of thing. I wanted to be angry, but honestly, I was more curious than anything else. And what did you find? We found out that you weren't just surviving without our money, my father said. You were thriving, building something real and substantial and profitable. We found out that Marcus wasn't some deadbeat who was bleeding you dry. He was a solid businessman with excellent credit and a spotless reputation. We found out, my mother added softly, that we'd raised a daughter who was stronger and more capable than we'd ever given her credit for. The words hit me like a physical blow. All my life I'd craved their approval, their recognition, their belief in my abilities. And here it was, finally, wrapped up in an admission of how wrong they'd been. Why didn't you just ask? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you have to investigate us like criminals? Because we were too proud to admit we might have been wrong, my father said, and too scared to reach out and be rejected. We talked for 3 hours that night, clearing the air, sharing what had happened in our lives during the months we'd been apart, tentatively rebuilding the bridges we'd all helped burn. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There was still too much hurt, too much broken trust, but it was a beginning. My parents wanted to know everything about the business, about our plans for expansion, about the challenges we'd faced and overcome. They asked thoughtful questions and offered advice when we asked for it, but they didn't try to take over or impose their vision on ours. Most importantly, they treated Marcus like family. My father shared stories from his early days in business, the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. My mother asked about his family, his background, his dreams for the future. They saw him, really saw him, for the first time. By the time we left the restaurant, we'd made plans to have dinner again the following week. Not at their house. We weren't ready for that level of intimacy yet, but somewhere neutral where we could continue rebuilding our relationship. Over the following months, we slowly found our way back to each other. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way. Old patterns of control and rebellion died hard, and we all had to learn new ways of relating to each other as adults rather than parent and child. But gradually, trust was rebuilt, love was rekindled, and something beautiful grew from the ashes of our broken relationship. The business continued to grow too. Word of mouth brought us higher-end clients, and our reputation for quality work and fair prices spread throughout the city. We opened a second location, then a third. We hired more staff, invested in better equipment, expanded our services. 2 years after that first terrible confrontation in my parents' living room, Marcus and I were running a multi-million-dollar automotive empire. We had 12 locations, over 100 employees, and a client list that read like a who's who of the city's elite. We were successful beyond my wildest dreams. But more than that, we were happy, fulfilled, partners in every sense of the word, building something together that was completely ours. My parents had been wrong about almost everything, but they'd been right about one thing. I had been naive at 22. Naive about love, about business, about the real world and how it worked. But my naivety hadn't been about Marcus or our relationship. It had been about them, about the unconditional nature of their love, about the values they claimed to hold but abandoned the moment those values became inconvenient. I'd thought I was choosing between love and money, between Marcus and my family, between happiness and security. But the real choice had been between authenticity and conformity, between building my own life and living the life someone else had planned for me. I'd chosen authenticity, and it had cost me everything I thought I valued. But in losing everything, I'd found something infinitely more precious. The knowledge that I was strong enough to build my own happiness, my own success, my own family. And the sweetest part of all? My parents, who had been so certain that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, now looked at Marcus and me with something that looked a lot like pride. They'd wanted me to marry someone successful and ambitious, someone who could provide for me and give me a good life. They just hadn't imagined that person might be a mechanic from the wrong side of town, or that their sheltered, spoiled daughter might be capable of building an empire with her bare hands and sheer determination. But we had, together, and we were just getting started. The third year was when everything changed. Not just the business, though that exploded beyond our wildest projections, but something fundamental shifted inside me. The naive girl who'd walked out of her parents' mansion had been replaced by someone harder, sharper, more calculating. Someone who remembered every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment of doubt that had been thrown at her like daggers. I suppose it started with the Henderson account. Margaret Henderson was one of my mother's closest friends, a society matron who'd been present at more than one dinner party where my parents had complained about their rebellious daughter and her unfortunate choices. I knew this because my mother, in one of our tentative reconciliation dinners, had let it slip that Margaret always asked about me with that particular tone of pity reserved for fallen socialites. "Oh, that poor Whitmore girl," my mother had quoted her, attempting to laugh it off, throwing her life away on that mechanic. Such a waste of breeding. The memory of those words was still burning in my chest 6 months later when Margaret's Bentley limousine broke down on the highway and was towed to our main location. She didn't recognize me at first. The girl in designer clothes had been replaced by a woman in tailored business suits who could discuss transmission repairs and profit margins with equal expertise. When she finally made the connection, watching me efficiently coordinate the repair of her precious vehicle, the shock on her face was almost worth the years of struggle it had taken to get there. "Sophia?" she'd gasped, her voice high and tight. "Sophia Whitmore? It's Sophia Chen now," I'd said smoothly, enjoying the way her eyes widened at the revelation that Marcus and I had married in a small ceremony the previous spring. "How can we help you today, Mrs. Henderson?" The way she'd stammered through the interaction, clearly trying to reconcile the polished businesswoman in front of her with whatever tragic image my parents had painted, was delicious. But what was even more satisfying was the call I received from my mother that evening. "Margaret Henderson called me today," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. "She had her car repaired at one of your shops." "That's right," I'd replied, making notes on a supplier contract while we talked. "Transmission trouble. We had her back on the road within 4 hours." She was impressed, my mother had admitted. "With the facility, with your staff, with your professionalism." She said she'd never received better service anywhere. I'd smiled into the phone, a cold, satisfied smile that my mother couldn't see, but that I felt in every cell of my body. We pride ourselves on exceeding expectations. That was the moment I realized that revenge didn't have to be loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, methodical, served one successful interaction at a time until the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. Every client we served impeccably, every expansion we completed ahead of schedule, every industry award we won was another nail in the coffin of their initial judgment. My parents had thrown me away because they thought I was weak, dependent, destined to fail without their support. They'd assumed Marcus was a gold digger who would drag me down to his level. They'd been convinced that within months I'd come crawling back, begging for forgiveness and ready to dump my inappropriate boyfriend for someone more suitable. Instead, we'd built something that made their precious real estate empire look quaint by comparison. By year 4, Chen Automotive Group had grown into a regional powerhouse. We operated 15 locations across 3 states, employed over 300 people, and had become the preferred service provider for luxury car dealerships throughout the region. Our annual revenue had crept past the $10 million mark, and industry publications were starting to take notice of our innovative approach to automotive service. But it was the small moments that satisfied me most. Like when my father's business partner, Robert Steinberg, brought his vintage Porsche to our flagship location and spent an hour marveling at our state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment. Or when the mayor's wife, whose opinion carried significant weight in their social circle, raved about our customer service at a charity luncheon my mother attended. I had no idea Sophia was running such an impressive operation. I'd heard through the grapevine. Robert says they're revolutionizing the automotive service industry. Each compliment, each impressed comment, each grudging admission of our success was carefully cataloged in my memory. Not out of petty spite, or not entirely, but because I was building something bigger than a business. I was constructing an undeniable case for my worth, my judgment, my ability to choose my own path. Marcus sensed the change in me, though he was too diplomatic to comment on it directly. He'd catch me sometimes, staring at our financial reports with an expression that was less satisfaction than calculation, and I'd see concern flicker across his face. "You okay?" he'd ask, settling beside me in our home office. A far cry from his old apartment, though still modest by the standards I'd grown up with. "Just thinking about the Patterson deal," I'd say, or the Morrison expansion, or whatever legitimate business concern I could deflect with. And it wasn't entirely a lie. I was thinking about business. But I was also thinking about the look on my father's face when he inevitably realized that his naive little girl had built something that dwarfed his achievements. The Patterson deal was actually a perfect example of how my approach had evolved. Patterson Real Estate was one of my father's biggest competitors, and when they approached us about servicing their entire fleet of company vehicles, I saw an opportunity that went beyond simple business expansion. I spent weeks crafting the perfect proposal, one that would not only secure the account, but position us as the preferred automotive partner for their entire network of properties. When Patterson's CEO, David Patterson himself, called to accept our terms, I made sure the contract signing took place at the country club where my parents were members. It wasn't coincidence that I scheduled the meeting for the same afternoon as my mother's regular bridge game. It wasn't accident that I wore my most expensive suit, one I'd earned with my own money, and arrived in the Tesla I'd purchased with our first million in profits. And it certainly wasn't chance that I made sure to greet several of my parents' friends warmly before disappearing into the private dining room where Patterson and I would finalize a deal worth more than my father's annual revenue. The whispers started before I'd even finished my appetizer. By the time dessert was served, half the club knew that little Sophia Whitmore, the one who'd thrown her life away on a car mechanic, had just signed a 7-figure contract with one of the city's most successful real estate moguls. My phone rang that evening while I was reviewing the signed contracts. "Congratulations on the Patterson deal," my father said without preamble. "That's quite an achievement." "Thank you," I replied, not bothering to ask how he'd heard. "The Society Gossip Network moved faster than fiber optic internet. David Patterson isn't easy to impress," he continued. "He must have been very confident in your capabilities to commit to that kind of partnership." "We've built a reputation for delivering results," I said. "Mr. Patterson recognizes quality when he sees it." There was a long pause, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in my father's head. He was a smart man. He understood the implications of what had just happened. His daughter, the one he'd written off as a naive romantic, had just secured a deal that put her in direct competition with his own business interests. "I'm proud of you," he said finally, and something in his voice made my throat tighten unexpectedly. "What you and Marcus have built? It's extraordinary." For a moment, I felt the old warmth, the daughterly desire for his approval that had driven so many of my childhood decisions. Then I remembered the cold dismissal in his voice that night 4 years ago, the way he'd looked at Marcus like something he'd scrape off his shoe, the casual cruelty of cutting off his own daughter for the crime of loving someone they deemed unsuitable. "We've worked hard for it," I said, my voice steady. "No handouts, no family connections, no safety net. Just talent, determination, and the kind of partnership you didn't think was possible." The pointed reminder hung in the air between us. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sophia, about that night, ancient history," I interrupted, though we both knew it wasn't. "I need to go. Early meeting tomorrow." I hung up before he could respond, then sat staring at the Patterson contract spread across my desk. 7 figures. More money than I'd ever imagined when I was crying in my Honda Civic on the side of the highway, wondering how I'd survive without my parents' support. But the money wasn't the point anymore. The money was just a way of keeping score. Year 5 brought the Automotive Innovation Award from the National Service Industry Association, a recognition that put us on the map nationally. The award ceremony was held in Chicago, and Marcus and I flew there together, along with our senior management team. As I stood on that stage, accepting the award for revolutionary customer service excellence, I thought about the girl who'd been dismissed as too naive to make her own decisions. The industry magazine interview that followed was syndicated in publications across the country. The photo, Marcus and me standing in front of our flagship location, him in his best suit, me in a power dress that cost more than my parents' monthly grocery bill, ended up in the business section of our local newspaper. I bought 50 copies of that newspaper. Not because I needed them, but because I wanted to have them available for anyone who might have forgotten how this story started. My mother called the day after the article ran. "I saw the piece in the Tribune," she said. "The photo is lovely." "Thank you." "The reporter mentioned that you're expanding into the Midwest market." "That's right. 5 new locations over the next 18 months. That's incredible, Sophia." Her voice was soft, almost wondering. "When you were little, you used to build these elaborate businesses out of your dollhouse furniture. I should have remembered that when you told us about your plans with Marcus." It was the closest she'd come to a real apology, and part of me wanted to accept it gracefully, to let the past be the past and focus on our rebuilt relationship. But another part of me, the part that had been forged in the fire of their rejection, wasn't ready to let them off the hook quite so easily. "I remember those dollhouse businesses," I said. "I also remember you telling me they were cute, but that I shouldn't expect to actually run a company someday. That a girl from a good family didn't need to worry about such things." "I never said—" "You said a lot of things, Mom. About me, about Marcus, about our future together. Most of them were wrong." The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, she sighed. "I know we hurt you," she said quietly. "I know we failed you as parents. I just hope that someday you can forgive us." "I'm working on it," I said, and it was true. I was working on forgiveness, on moving past the anger and hurt. But I was also working on something else, a comprehensive demonstration of just how wrong they'd been about everything. The expansion into the Midwest was just the beginning. By year 6, we'd grown to 25 locations and were being courted by private equity firms interested in funding national expansion. The valuations they were throwing around were staggering, numbers that would have made my father's real estate empire look like a corner lemonade stand. But I wasn't interested in selling. Not yet. Because selling would mean giving up control, and control was the whole point. Every decision we made, every success we achieved, every milestone we reached was proof that I'd been right to trust my own judgment over their fears. The breaking point came at my cousin Rebecca's wedding. It was a lavish affair at the country club, the kind of society event where everyone who mattered would be in attendance. My parents had been nervous about inviting Marcus and me, not because they were ashamed anymore, but because they weren't sure how we'd be received by the extended family and their social circle. They needn't have worried. By then, our success was impossible to ignore, even by the most determined snobs. When we walked into that reception, conversations paused. Not out of disapproval, but out of curiosity and respect. The whispered conversations weren't about the mechanic's daughter who'd thrown her life away. They were about the power couple who'd built a business empire from nothing. Uncle Richard, who'd once made snide comments about my phase, now wanted to discuss our expansion strategy. Aunt Caroline, who'd predicted I'd be back within 6 months, was asking about potential investment opportunities. Even my grandmother, the family matriarch who'd initially refused to acknowledge my marriage to Marcus, spent 20 minutes grilling him about his business philosophy with the kind of intensity usually reserved for potential heirs. The moment that crystallized everything happened during the father-daughter dance. As I watched my cousin Rebecca swaying with Uncle Richard, I noticed my own father standing alone at the edge of the dance floor, watching us with an expression I'd never seen before. "He looks proud," Marcus murmured in my ear, following my gaze. "He looks regretful," I corrected, and I was right. That wasn't pride on my father's face, it was regret. Deep, bone-crushing regret for the years he'd missed, the relationship he'd damaged, the daughter he'd almost lost because of his own narrow-minded assumptions. When the dance ended, he approached us at our table. "Dance with your old man?" he asked, extending his hand with a hesitancy that was foreign to the confident businessman I'd grown up with. I let him lead me onto the dance floor, hyper-aware of the eyes watching us, the family members who remembered the drama of our estrangement and were curious about our reconciliation. "I owe you more than an apology," he said as we moved to the music. "I owe you acknowledgement. You were right about Marcus, about your ability to build something meaningful together, about your own strength and judgment. I was wrong about everything that mattered." "Yes," I said simply. "You were—" He flinched at the bluntness of my response, but he didn't argue. "I know I can't undo the damage I caused," he said, "but I want you to know that what you've accomplished, it's beyond anything I imagined possible. You've surpassed every measure of success I ever used." "I know," I said, and there was satisfaction in my voice that I didn't try to hide. "We've built something extraordinary. You have—" He paused, then added quietly, "I used to worry that you'd inherited too much of your mother's soft heart and not enough of my business instincts. I was wrong about that too. You're ruthless when you need to be." The comment surprised me. "Ruthless? The Patterson deal?" he said with a rueful smile. "Signing it at the country club where half my friends could see. The automotive award ceremony where you made sure the press knew you'd built the business without family support. The way you've systematically proven wrong every person who doubted you. That's not accident, Sophia. That's strategy." He was right, and we both knew it. What had started as a love story, girl meets boy, parents disapprove, couple proves them wrong, had evolved into something more calculated. I hadn't just been building a business, I'd been building a case. Every success was evidence, every achievement was testimony, every milestone was another piece of proof that their judgment had been catastrophically wrong. Maybe I learned more from you than either of us realized, I said. The song ended, but neither of us moved to leave the dance floor. Around us, other couples swayed to the next number, but we stood facing each other in a moment of understanding that had taken 6 years to reach. "I'm proud of you," he said, and this time I heard the weight behind the words. Not the conditional pride of a parent whose child had finally lived up to expectations, but the awed respect of someone witnessing something extraordinary. "Thank you," I said and meant it. But as we walked back to our table, where Marcus was chatting with my mother about our latest expansion plans, I realized that his acknowledgement wasn't the victory I'd thought it would be. I'd spent 6 years building toward this moment, the moment when my father would admit he'd been wrong, when my parents would recognize what they'd almost thrown away, when everyone who doubted us would be forced to acknowledge our success. And now that I had it, I felt empty. Satisfied, yes. Vindicated, absolutely. But also hollow, like I'd been running toward a finish line that turned out to be just another starting point. The real transformation happened 6 months later, when we received an acquisition offer that changed everything. Global Tech Industries, one of the largest automotive service conglomerates in North America, wanted to buy Chen Automotive Group for a sum that was frankly obscene. $800 million, Marcus said, staring at the offer letter like it might disappear if he looked away. "They want to pay us $800 million. We were sitting in our home office, the same space where we'd planned our first expansion, where we'd celebrated our first million in revenue, where we'd made every major decision that had brought us to this moment. The offer letter lay on the desk between us like a winning lottery ticket. "It's a good offer," I said, though good was an understatement. It was a life-changing, generation-changing, build-a-legacy offer. "But," Marcus prompted, knowing me well enough to hear the hesitation in my voice. "But selling means giving up control," I said. "It means stepping back from something we built with our own hands. It also means financial security beyond anything we ever dreamed of," he pointed out. "It means we could do anything we want for the rest of our lives." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where we'd built our empire. Somewhere out there, my parents were probably having dinner at their country club, discussing their modest real estate deals and their comfortable but unremarkable life. They'd built something solid and respectable, but they'd never built anything that could command this kind of attention from a major corporation. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. The question hung in the air while I processed everything we'd accomplished, everything we'd proven, everything we'd built together. 6 years ago, I'd been a privileged college student with no real-world experience, no practical skills, and no understanding of what it meant to work for something instead of having it handed to you. Now I was co-owner of a business worth nearly $1 billion, a success story that industry publications wrote articles about, a woman who'd proven that love and ambition weren't mutually exclusive. I'd won, completely, utterly, undeniably won. "I want to sell," I said, and as soon as I spoke the words, I knew they were right. "I want to take their offer and start the next chapter of our lives." Marcus joined me at the window, slipping his arms around me from behind. "No regrets?" "None," I said, leaning back against his chest. "We set out to prove them wrong, and we did. We set out to build something extraordinary, and we did. We set out to show that we could succeed on our own terms, and we did. So what's next?" I smiled, thinking about the possibilities that $800 million would open up. Next, we enjoy watching them realize exactly what they almost lost. The sale took 3 months to finalize, during which news of the acquisition leaked to the business press. The story was everywhere: local newspapers, industry magazines, even a segment on the National Business News Network. "Local automotive chain sells for record sum." Read one headline: "From startup to sellout, the Chen Automotive success story," proclaimed another. My favorite was the piece in Forbes that detailed our journey from a single location shop to a regional powerhouse, with particular emphasis on the fact that we'd built the entire enterprise without outside investment or family support. The article included quotes from industry analysts praising our innovative approach to customer service and our disciplined expansion strategy. But the most satisfying coverage came from the society page of our local newspaper, which ran a feature titled "Local Power Couple Strikes Gold." The article included photos from Rebecca's wedding, quotes from prominent clients praising our service, and a detailed breakdown of what the acquisition meant for the local economy. My parents called the day after the Forbes article hit newsstands. "We saw the article," my mother said when I answered the phone. $800 million. Sophia, that's incredible. We're very proud, my father added. He was on the extension, something he'd started doing since our reconciliation, as if he didn't want to miss any part of our conversations. "Thank you," I said, though pride wasn't exactly what I was feeling. What I was feeling was more complex, satisfaction mixed with melancholy, vindication tempered by the recognition that the victory I'd been chasing for 6 years had finally been achieved. "What will you do now?" my mother asked. It was a fair question. Marcus and I had spent weeks discussing our options, exploring possibilities we'd never had the luxury to consider before. Travel the world, start another business, invest in causes we cared about, buy a house on the beach and spend our days reading books and walking in the sand. "We're thinking about starting a foundation," I said. "Something focused on helping young entrepreneurs who don't have access to traditional funding sources." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The girl who'd been cut off from her family's money was now in a position to provide financial support to other people following their dreams against the odds. "That sounds wonderful," my father said, and I could hear genuine enthusiasm in his voice. "If you need any advice on structuring that kind of organization, I'll call you," I promised and meant it. Our relationship had evolved beyond the simple parent-child dynamic of my youth. Now we related to each other as equals, as business people who'd both achieved success in our respective fields. But there was still one more conversation I needed to have, one final piece of the puzzle that had to be put in place before I could truly move on from the anger and hurt that had driven me for so many years. I called them 2 weeks after the sale was finalized, when all the paperwork had been signed and the money had been transferred to our accounts. Marcus and I were officially worth more than $800 million, and the number was so surreal that I couldn't quite wrap my mind around it. "I want to have dinner," I said when my mother answered the phone. "The 4 of us. At your house this time." There was a pause, and I could practically hear her exchanging glances with my father. "Of course," she said finally. "When would you like to come?" "This weekend. Saturday night." We arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, pulling into the circular driveway of the house I'd grown up in. The same driveway I'd driven out of 6 years earlier, crying and furious and terrified of what the future might hold. Now I was returning as a woman worth more money than they'd probably see in their lifetimes, married to the man they'd once dismissed as a gold-digging loser. The house looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing. The marble floors that had once seemed so grand now looked merely expensive, lacking the warmth of the home Marcus and I had built together. My parents greeted us at the door with hugs and smiles, but I could see the nervousness in their eyes, the uncertainty about why I'd wanted to come here for this particular conversation. Dinner was pleasant but strained, filled with careful small talk about our travel plans, the foundation we were considering, the impact of the acquisition on our former employees. We were all being so polite, so careful not to mention the elephant in the room, the years of estrangement, the cruel things that had been said, the damage that had been done and slowly, carefully repaired. Finally, over dessert, I decided to address what we were all thinking. "I want to talk about that night 6 years ago," I said, setting down my fork and looking directly at my parents. "The night you cut me off?" My mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. My father straightened in his chair, his expression guarded. "Sophia," my mother said carefully, "I thought we'd moved past." "We have," I interrupted. "But I need to say something, and I need you to hear it." Marcus reached over and took my hand, offering silent support. He knew this conversation was important to me, knew I needed to close this chapter of our story properly before we could move on to whatever came next. "That night you told me I was naive," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling in my chest. "You told me Marcus was using me. You told me I was throwing my life away. You were wrong about all of that. But there's something you need to understand." My parents sat perfectly still, waiting. "You didn't just cut me off from your money that night," I continued. "You cut me off from your faith in me, from your belief in my judgment, my intelligence, my ability to make good decisions. And that hurt more than losing the financial support. That hurt more than dropping out of Stanford or living on ramen noodles or working 18-hour days. My mother's eyes were filling with tears, but I pressed on. But here's what you also did, I said, and now there was steel in my voice. You gave me the greatest gift you've ever given me. You forced me to prove to myself what I was capable of. You made me discover strength I never knew I had. You pushed me to build something extraordinary with the man I love. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking their perfectly manicured backyard, the same view I'd stared at countless times during my privileged childhood. If you hadn't cut me off, I might have spent my whole life believing I needed you, I said. I might have married some appropriate man from the right family and lived a comfortable, unremarkable life supported by money I didn't earn. Instead, I married my best friend and built an empire. I turned back to face them and saw that my father was crying now too, something I'd seen maybe 3 times in my entire life. So thank you, I said, and I meant it. Thank you for being exactly as wrong as you were. Thank you for underestimating me so completely that I had no choice but to exceed every expectation. Thank you for giving me the chance to discover who I really am when everything is stripped away, except love and determination. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Marcus looked surprised by the direction the conversation had taken. Finally, my father spoke. "We don't deserve your gratitude," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We failed you when you needed us most." "Yes," I agreed. "You did. But your failure became my foundation. Your rejection became my motivation. Your doubt became my driving force." I walked back to the table and sat down, taking Marcus's hand again. "I spent 6 years being angry with you," I said. 6 years wanting to prove you wrong, wanting to show you what you'd lost, wanting to make you regret every cruel word you said about the man I love. And I did. I proved you wrong beyond any shadow of a doubt. But the anger doesn't serve me anymore. My mother was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find words. "I forgive you," I said simply. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of the anger. I forgive you because holding on to it would poison the beautiful life Marcus and I have built together. I forgive you because forgiveness is the final victory." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and I felt something lift from my chest that I'd been carrying for 6 long years. The weight of resentment, the burden of proving them wrong, the exhausting need to document every success as evidence of their failure, all of it dissolved in that moment of conscious choice to let it go. My parents both stood up and came around the table, and we had the kind of group hug we hadn't shared since I was a child. This time, though, it wasn't the embrace of a dependent daughter seeking approval. It was the embrace of equals who'd found their way back to love through the wreckage of their mistakes. "I'm sorry," my mother whispered into my hair. "I'm so sorry." "I know," I said. "I love you too." Later that night, as Marcus and I drove home to our own house, the house we'd bought with money we'd earned, furnished with things we'd chosen, filled with memories we'd created together, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before that terrible confrontation 6 years earlier. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked as we pulled into our driveway. I thought about the question, taking inventory of my emotional state. Relief, certainly. Satisfaction at having achieved everything I'd set out to prove. Gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. And underneath it all, a quiet joy that had nothing to do with money or revenge or proving anyone wrong. "I feel free," I said finally. "For the first time in 6 years, I feel completely free." We'd won? Not just financially, though the $800 million in our accounts was certainly evidence of our success. We'd won in every way that mattered. We'd proven that love was stronger than money, that determination could overcome any obstacle, that 2 people with a shared vision could build something extraordinary together. But more than that, we'd won the right to define success on our own terms. We'd won the freedom to pursue our dreams without anyone else's approval or support. We'd won the knowledge that we were capable of far more than anyone, including ourselves, had ever imagined. The girl who'd walked out of her parents' house 6 years earlier, crying and broken and terrified, had been transformed into a woman who could face any challenge with confidence. The mechanic who'd been dismissed as a gold-digging loser had become a respected businessman and equal partner in a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Together, we'd built something that was worth far more than the money global tech had paid for it. We'd built a partnership based on mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and absolute trust. We'd built a love story that could survive any test. We'd built a life that was completely, authentically ours. And in the end, That was the sweetest revenge of all. Not the money, not the success, not the moment when my parents finally admitted they'd been wrong. The sweetest revenge was the life itself, the beautiful, extraordinary, hard-won life we'd created together despite everyone who'd said it was impossible. My parents had tried to separate us because they thought our love was built on illusion, that it wouldn't survive the test of real-world pressures. They'd been wrong about that too. Our love hadn't just survived, it had been forged stronger by every challenge, deepened by every shared struggle, made more precious by the knowledge that we'd chosen each other over easier paths. 6 years later, as I fell asleep in the arms of the man my parents had once called unsuitable, I smiled, thinking about how perfectly, completely, beautifully wrong they'd been about everything that mattered, and how grateful I was that their wrongness had led us to discover what we were truly capable of building together. The naive girl who'd believed in unconditional love was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that the best love, the kind that lasts, the kind that transforms lives, the kind that builds empires, is absolutely conditional. Conditional on respect, on partnership, on the willingness to fight for each other and dream together and never, ever give up. That was the love Marcus and I had found. That was the love that had carried us through every impossible day and delivered us to this moment of perfect, hard-earned happiness. And that was worth more than all the money in the world.